All right, good morning. Hey, let's thank these folks again for leading us in worship. Fantastic. We really appreciate it. You guys have done a fantastic job. Todd, I thought you were a little showy, but I really appreciate. Flamboyant is the word, but I really appreciate everybody else. And then the people in the youth band, of course, after their set, they go back there and have a smoke. But they what energy they bring. That's fantastic. And I also want to thank the tech guys. I mean, they have done everything they know to do this week to make this a great week for us. Let's give them a round of applause. Yeah. And then finally, along with you, I have been deeply encouraged by Danny's messages every night from Colossians. I love the way he dove into the word there and to talk about virtue, which is so important and so practical. And so let's give Danny another round of applause, shall we? Yeah. Just honestly, being with this team. Oh, and speaking of talent, I don't know if you got a chance to hear the concert with Dave and Bobby and Rags, I think it is. But they were amazing last night. And so, let's give them a round of applause, too. That's good stuff. So much talent. In fact, I was just thinking this morning that what I'd like to do, I hadn't planned on this, but I thought I would, just as an act of gratitude, I guess, I would do something special. It's our last morning. And so I've decided this morning that I'm going to rap. And I know. A lot of you probably, when I walked up on stage Monday morning, looked at me and said to yourselves, I'll bet the dude raps. And actually I do. You should have seen me at Christmas, just tons of rapping. And I do a little rap here. And I'm going to do it this morning. And I'm glad that we've asked the children to leave the room. It's not pretty. But I want to ask you to give me a simple beat, just a really basic beat. Okay, so just give me like a, just like that, okay? And don't speed it up. And I'll sprain my tongue. Okay, like, this is actually the books of the Bible, written by a buddy of mine named James Ward, who's a rhythm and blues keyboard player down in Chattanooga, Tennessee. And it goes like this: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Joshua, Judges, I want to tell you the truth about the book of Ruth on the 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, and all those things lead to Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther, and Job. I want to go to heaven in a righteous robe, singing Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Solomon's song, and the prophets are these: Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Jay's lineage, Ezekiel, and there to the lions went, Hosea, Joel, and Amos's tale, Obadiah, Jonah in the belly of the whale, Micah, and Nahum, and Habakkuk's cry, Haggai, Zephaniah, then Zechariah. The last Old Testament books reveal. Malachi points to a brand new deal. Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and John, and story of Jesus. And then move on to Acts and the letters of Paul, Romans, and 1st and 2nd Corinthians, all Galatians, Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, and move on to 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, 1st Timothy, 2nd Timothy, Titus, Philemon, and Hebrews, and James, and 2 books from Peter and John's, all 3, Jude, and Revelation. You'll see these are written that you might believe that Jesus is the Christ and his grace receive. Thank you. Thank you. I think you're mostly just grateful that I didn't keel over. Not me doing it. You can actually Google Holy Books James Ward, and I think you'll be able to find that somewhere. God help us if there's a video of that anywhere. I don't think there is. I'm pretty sure there's not. Yesterday, we talked about Paul's experience of being shipwrecked in a storm off the coast of North Africa, and how sometimes God uses the storms in our lives in surprising ways to bring about his purposes, and how that assurance made it possible for Paul, even in the height of the storm, to say with confidence, Acts chapter 27, verse 25, take heart, I have faith in God. In our final study this week on our discussion of faith, we're going to be looking again at the Apostle Paul, but we're going to turn our attention this morning from storms to thorns. We're going to shift our attention from what the book of Acts described as a violent storm at sea and focus instead on what the Apostle Paul in 2 Corinthians 12 calls a thorn in the flesh. And before I go too far in this, let me just explain how I think they might be different. They might be a little bit different. Storms, at least the way I'm using the word this morning, is the kind of big crisis events that blow in hard across the landscape of our lives. They're violent. They're obvious. Everybody sees them, but they're usually seasonal. They're more short term. Thorns, on the other hand, are like those nagging stresses, chronic pains, irritations that just get under your skin and cause ongoing pain. They don't do a ton of damage on the outside. Folks around you may not even be aware of your suffering, but they can remain embedded in your body, in your heart, and your soul for years. And untreated, they can cause infection and decay on the inside. So storms and thorns, both of them are challenges to our faith. So let's finish up this morning by talking about this thorn in the flesh. If you have a Bible, turn with me to 2 Corinthians chapter 12. 2 Corinthians chapter 12, we're going to begin reading right there in verse 1. 2 Corinthians 12, verse 1. I must go on boasting, though there is nothing to be gained by it. I will go on to visions and revelations of the Lord. I know a man in Christ who 14 years ago was caught up to the third heaven. Whether in the body or out of the body, I do not know. God knows. And I know that this man was caught up into paradise. Whether in the body or out of the body, I don't know. God knows. And he heard things that cannot be told, which man may not utter. On behalf of this man, I will boast. But on my own behalf, I will not boast, except of my weaknesses. Though if I should wish to boast, I would not be a fool, for I would be speaking the truth. But I refrain from it, so that no one may think more of me than he sees in me or hears from me. Verse 7. So to keep me from becoming conceited, because of the surpassing greatness of the revelations, a thorn was given me in the flesh, a messenger of Satan to harass me, to keep me from becoming conceited. Three times I pleaded with the Lord about this, that it should leave me. But he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore, I will boast all the more gladly of my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ may rest upon me. For the sake of Christ, then, I am content with weaknesses, insults, hardships, persecutions, and calamities. For when I am weak, then I am strong. There is a book written by a buddy of mine named Duffy. It's called Would You Rather? Would You Rather? And it's written to provide youth pastors with discussion starters, kind of warm-ups for a small group experience. And the book is really nothing more than 300 questions, each of which begin with the words, would you rather? So it's got questions like, would you rather be a doctor or a lawyer? Would you rather put together a 200,000-piece jigsaw puzzle or read the dictionary from cover to cover? Would you rather be rich or famous? I love this one. Would you rather have terrible acne or be bald? You're laughing, but look at that complexion. Would you rather have blistered lips or paper cuts on each finger? Would you rather give up Facebook or give up Netflix? Let's just see a quick show of hands. How many would rather give up Facebook? Wow, shame on you. How many would rather give up Netflix? Okay, about 10 Christians. Yeah, that's kind of discouraging. Would you rather be in tribal council on Survivor or be a guest on The View? Would you rather dive into a pool of acid or swim in a pond full of blood-sucking leeches? You're going, Duffy, that's like the previous question. Ooh, ouch. Yeah. You know, it's funny because when you ask that question to middle school guys, they'll go, can we do both? Yeah. Would you rather look stupid or be stupid? Would you rather faint during your wedding ceremony and recover an hour later, or throw up during your ceremony and just keep right on going? It's kind of a fun way to get folks thinking and get folks talking. And I'm actually going to throw out to you a would you rather question this morning. It's not actually in Doug's book, but it kind of helps us to jumpstart our time in the Word. It's an interesting question. Would you rather suffer short term through a big violent storm, or live longer, but have a longer term with an ongoing irritating thorn? So I'll just ask it again. Would you rather suffer short term through a big violent storm, or live longer term with an ongoing irritating thorn? Now, you don't have to answer that question, because I realize in reality, some of you have lived it. Some of you have lived it. But what I want us to observe this morning is that when you line up Acts chapter 27 alongside 2 Corinthians 12, you realize the Apostle Paul didn't get to choose. He faced both. He faced both big storms and irritating thorns. And yet, and here's again what's stunning, is that in the midst of both the storms and the thorns, you can still hear loud and clear Paul's testimony from Acts 27:25. Take heart, for I have faith in God. And what we're going to do this morning, for the second morning in a row, is sort of wrestle with this question, this issue. What does it take for us to develop that sort of attitude in the midst of our hard times? And what does that teach us about authentic faith? And of course, this isn't just a theoretical question, because a lot of us here this morning are stuck with some situation that causes us ongoing irritation and ongoing pain. You maybe heard the story about this guy went to the grocery store, and he had to pick up a couple of things his wife had asked him to pick up on the way home. He walks in there, and he's kind of roaming around trying to find the stuff. But as he looks around the store, he notices there is this man, a father, who's pushing his cart through the store. But in the little basket there of the cart, his little son is perched with his legs through the two holes there. And he, the son is kind of fussing and sort of crying. He's probably like, I don't know, 1 or 2 years old. But what was interesting was the dad, as he pushes the cart, he's going, come on, Albert, calm down, Albert. Come on, Albert, cheer up, Albert. And that was sort of amusing to him, because it wasn't his child. But what was particularly intriguing was this old lady who saw apparently the same entourage and decided that this would be entertainment for her as she makes her way through the store. She would just follow this man and her little boy. And so there they go down the aisle. But one thing he began to notice, the further they went, is the louder the little boy got. As time went on, it got louder and louder. And so the little boy's, crying a little bit more now. It's not just not whining, it's crying. And the father's kind of pushing the cart, picked up his pace a little bit. Come on, Albert. We'll be out in a minute, Albert. It's okay, Albert. Be cool, Albert. Come on, Albert. And, it got louder and louder. Now they're over into canned goods, and the dad has picked up his pace even more. In fact, the old lady could hardly keep up, and now it's just getting ugly. The little kid is just screaming, and he's really yelling loud, and the dad is just like, "Come on, Albert, don't blow your cool, Albert. Be out in a minute, Albert. Keep it in, Albert." And finally, they get over to produce, and by now it's just turmoil. It's just horrible. People are turning their heads. What's all that racket about? It's this little kid, and he's screaming. His face is red. His nose is running, and the dad just careening off the aisles. "Come on, Albert. We'll be out in a minute, Albert. Don't blow. Keep it in, Albert. Don't blow your cool, Albert." Finally, they get to the cash register, and the father is there with the little boy, and the kid is just screaming. And this little lady cannot contain herself any longer. She's got to get involved. And so she reaches over, pats this little boy on the head, and says, my, Albert, bless your heart. We're not feeling very well today at all, are we? And just pats him on the head. And she said, "Sir, I tell you, I am so sorry that Albert is feeling poorly, but you have remarkable patience. I don't know how you do it. And the dad just kind of looked at her and said, lady, you don't understand. I'm Albert. And I think a lot of us resonate with that. I mean, a lot of us have Alberts in our lives. We understand the frustration and the discouragement of thorns. And of course, here in the company of family and friends on a beautiful Friday morning at Mount Hermon, we can sort of laugh about this stuff. We're all too aware in real life with the pain and irritation of real thorns. Hey, the hurt is real. Laughter doesn't come so easily. The discouragement easily can snuff out our joy. Thorns hurt. They hurt. Maybe it's a physical ailment that simply shows no sign of improvement, and it's just a daily pain you just have to live with. I actually read that statistically, 1 in every 10 Americans suffers from some kind of chronic pain. That means there are quite a few of us in here this morning who are probably dealing with ongoing chronic pain. Or maybe it's a marriage that started out like a bed of roses, but now it sort of languishes in this dry desert without any real joy, without any real authentic companionship. Or maybe for some of us this morning, it's the marriage that you desire deeply but have never had. The loneliness that haunts you every day because you've never found that soulmate that you've prayed for and that you so badly want. Maybe it's an addiction that started out as a remedy to pain, but now has become the source of even greater pain. It goes on and on and on. Maybe it's just a sense that you're never going to get the job you want. You're never going to pay off your credit card bills. You're never going to lose that 20 pounds. It just stares at you in the mirror. And the question becomes, in the midst of all this irritation and frustration, how did Paul do it? How did Paul do it? How did he manage to live with heart and commitment and contentment even with the daily pain of the thorns? Well, we're going to answer that question this morning by considering 3 key realities in Paul's situation. We're going to look at the problem. We're going to think about the process, and we're going to consider the promise. So problem, process, promise, simple outline. Let's dive into it. First of all, the problem. If you look back at the text, look at verse 7. Look at verse 7. Paul says, to keep me from becoming conceited, because of the surpassing greatness of the revelations, a thorn was given me in the flesh, a messenger of Satan to harass me, to keep me from becoming conceited. Now, Paul is totally transparent about his problem. He describes being harassed by a thorn in the flesh. But what does that actually mean? I mean, to answer that question, we really need to get a little bit of background. As I read through verses 1 and 6 a few moments ago, maybe you noticed this, Paul has this kind of weird almost sidebar where he talks about boasting and being caught up in what he calls the third heaven. And, what's this about? Well, in a nutshell, this is the situation that Paul faced in Corinth. His opponents and those who championed other rabbis and teachers strongly suggested that Paul simply didn't cut it as a teacher because in comparison to the other religious teachers, they were better speakers, maybe better looking, and they just generally had more charisma. And then to make matters worse, these other teachers tried to pad their reputation by bragging about how they'd had all these powerful mystical visions and close encounters. And so that's why Paul says, look, I don't want to brag. Bragging is kind of stupid. It puts the focus in the wrong place. But if you want to play that game, and that's what it takes to validate my ministry with you guys, okay, listen to this. And you can just tell Paul's uncomfortable with a bunch of rabbis talking smack because he doesn't even talk about himself in first person. Did you notice that? In verse 2, he says, I know a man in Christ. That's Paul. I know a man in Christ. That's Paul. He's talking about himself. And then he goes on to say, look, I didn't just have a vision of God. I had a visit with God in heaven. And that's very likely what he means with that phrase, caught up in the third heaven. He says, I don't know how it happened. And I'm not going to go into detail about what happened because that's not where I want the focus to be. But when it comes to apostolic credentials, and clearly it feels weird for Paul to even have to talk like this, but he says, I have more than any of you guys. If I were to brag, it would be legit. It would be truthful. And then just before he drops the mic, he says, however, if the focus is going to be on me, it's going to be on my weaknesses. It's going to be on my weaknesses because that puts the focus back on the power of Christ where it belongs. Now, that's what leads Paul to talk very openly and candidly about this problem, this thorn in the flesh. So again, verse 7, to keep me from becoming conceited because of the surpassing greatness of the revelations, a thorn was given me in the flesh, a messenger of Satan to harass me, to keep me from becoming conceited. Now, I think all of us can appreciate that having some sort of mysterious visit to paradise, to the third heaven, to have an audience with God, might tempt you to get a little cocky. All right, you'd be tempted to buy maybe a T-shirt that says third heaven. You'd wear it around other Corinthian teachers the way some people wear T-shirts from Hard Rock Cafe, Copenhagen. You want to say, yeah, I've been there. I've been there. And Paul certainly knew that this was a real temptation for him. In fact, we just read this. He mentions this temptation twice explicitly in the text in one verse. But if Paul knew he was susceptible to this kind of temptation, then the Lord for sure knew that. So, for his own spiritual welfare, Paul was given a thorn in the flesh, a messenger of Satan, to keep him from becoming conceited. Now, what does that phrase mean? A thorn in the flesh, a thorn in the flesh. And as you might imagine, there are a lot of ideas. I'm sure you've heard some of these. Some say because of that phrase, in the flesh, some have assumed it refers to some kind of physical disability. There are, in fact, a few passages that lend credibility to that theory. In Galatians chapter 4, verses 13 to 14, Paul actually refers to a bodily ailment that has impacted his ministry. And then there are other passages that kind of hint at something like this. And depending on which commentator you believe, the disability is pain in the ear or head or some sort of malarial fever or epilepsy or maybe even a type of sun blindness. We don't know for sure. And then there are other sources that have latched onto that phrase, messenger of Satan. Messenger of Satan. They suggest that Paul's thorn in the flesh was the constant opposition and treachery of these opposing sages and false teachers. In other words, Paul's thorn in the flesh were these people who were just a constant pain in the neck. Others yet still say, noting that, again, that messenger of Satan phrase, wonder if maybe it points to some besetting temptation that Paul was struggling with. And even though he didn't give in to it, it never left him. Some say it was just an ongoing, nagging temptation. And I'm pretty sure a bunch of us in this room know precisely what that feels like. And then finally, yet another explanation. Some people, some very rude people, and this is not funny, have wondered if the phrase, I have a thorn in the flesh, is proof that Paul was married. But the truth is, we don't know. We don't know. And I suspect God does not want us to know. God doesn't want us to know because if we knew Paul's thorn was this or if it was that, then we would make a special case out of him. We'd be tempted in our normal human way to say, oh, well, yeah. I mean, if that was my thorn in the flesh, if that was my problem, I'd be okay with that. But Paul's situation doesn't compare to what I'm struggling with. You can't believe what I'm dealing with, but God is wise, both in his revelations and in his reservations. He wants us to understand that he is on a blank check basis with us. Whatever is our problem, his grace is sufficient. It's not like some insurance policy where you go down the page and discover too late, oh, my pain, it's not covered. My thorn's not covered under this policy. We don't know for sure what was Paul's thorn in the flesh. But what we can clearly know about Paul's situation, and what so many of us know all too well, is that thorns are real, thorns hurt, and they are a problem. But Paul's response to this storm, to this thorn problem, helped him to understand that actually what caused him pain was also what, by God's grace, could make him strong. That what he was experiencing was what one writer described as the severe mercy of God. The severe mercy of God. It didn't feel like it. It didn't feel like it, but God was in the process of doing a deeper work in Paul through this storm. So let's talk about that process. Go now to verse 8. Paul writes, 3 times I pleaded with the Lord about this, that it should leave me. But he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore, I will boast all the more gladly of my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ may rest upon me. One of the fundamental principles of spiritual growth is what I like to call the morning sickness principle. The morning sickness principle. I actually shared this yesterday morning in staff devotions. The morning sickness principle simply reminds us that when it comes to spiritual maturity, the process doesn't always look like progress. I remember, Maggie and I, we had been married about 5 years when she first contracted pregnancy. And I remember the way she announced this to me, she didn't do anything cutesy, like she didn't put booties on my placemat or Pampers on my pillow or something like that. The way I was apprised of this wonderful news was I woke up one morning to the sound of her vomiting, which is a little bit out of her normal routine. So being a nurturing husband, I go in there, and there she is, bowed over the toilet, and I just said, honey, I'm trying to sleep. I go in there, and what's crazy? I didn't even get a chance to say a word. I didn't get a chance to say anything. She heard me walk in the bathroom, and all of a sudden, from her kneeling position, she looked up at me with this almost beatific expression, as if she had seen New Testament scrolls floating. It was just this look of wonder and awe. And that's when she said to me, we're pregnant. We're pregnant. And I wanted to celebrate the wonder, but it's hard. See your wife barfing her brains out. You're not going to go, this is beautiful. And I sure wasn't going to kiss her. But actually what she was saying was really important. She was saying, look, I get it. I understand what you think you see. I get all the evidence to the contrary. But guess what? Despite everything you see and hear, new life is stirring right before our very eyes. It may not look like it, but God's doing something amazing here right in our midst. And of course, I remember those months of, pregnancy, gestation, where we kind of hear from the doctor, yeah, you're doing okay and stuff. But on a daily basis, really, some of you will be able to relate to this, especially you husbands, that you don't really see much. I mean, you trust her, she's pregnant, I get it, but it's kind of hard to tell. Even when she started to show, that was really when it was kind of tough because I remember we'd be laying in bed and she would take my hand and she'd go, oh, the baby is moving. The baby's moving. And she put my hand on her stomach and I never felt a thing. Not a thing. And I don't want to hurt her feelings. I didn't want to say, let's be honest, you're just gaining weight. I went, oh yeah, look out, little buddy, ouch. I felt stuff. I felt nothing. Finally, the big day comes, and I was serving as a youth pastor up in Barrington, Rhode Island on the Narragansett Bay and suburb of Providence. So it's the middle of the night, and she goes, Duffy, it's time. I said, time for what? She goes, so we jet down to Women's and Infants Hospital in Providence, Rhode Island, and we get down there, and we're met by a very cheerful woman in a nice white dress, and she takes us to a room, and Maggie is in there, and we're kind of waiting, and she's probably in there like, this is our first child, maybe 10, 15 hours, a long time. Finally, this nurse shows up again with a big smile on her face, says, okay, Mrs. Robbins, you are ready. You are ready. We're going to take you into the labor suite. And I go, oh, the labor suite. Like we got an upgrade. This sounds nice. This sounds like, I kind of imagine, I don't know, I sort of imagine sort of a nice, dimly lit room with carpet and maybe some soft music, maybe a TV, I could watch while she finishes up. And it just sounded delightful, Well, the labor suite at Women's and Infants Hospital was essentially a wide hallway, probably maybe 12 to 15 feet. I'm not good at that kind of thing, but a wide hallway on which women were lined up on gurneys down the hall, and each of them were separated by a canvas curtain hanging from these chains connected to the ceiling. And I don't know if the hospital was aware of this or not, but these curtains were not actually soundproof. And so while we are trying to go through our breathing, our Lamaze training and everything, we're hearing from the other stalls just horrific blood-curdling sounds. I mean, just screams, groans, women saying naughty things about their partners. It was just bad. And I could see it in Maggie's eyes because she was going, I don't know what they're doing now, but we apparently haven't gotten to it yet. And I was thinking, I don't know what they're giving birth to, but I think it might be a trapezoid. All I know is it's just like, holy cow, this is bad. This is gruesome. And I remember thinking, if you just came in and just landed from Mars into the labor suite, you'd go, what? This is ghastly. This is horrible. This is ugly. And somebody go, well, actually, no. What you're hearing is the sound of new life coming to be. But the process doesn't look like progress. Even when the baby's born, right? It's like, one guy said when his son emerged from the womb, he's covered with all this muck, and he goes, honey, you gave birth to a lizard. And now, now put that back. It's not what you think. It doesn't look the way you think. Well, this is very much akin to spiritual growth, because a lot of times we have this idea that spirituality and spiritual is this nice, wonderful new birth, and it's just going to be fantastic. Listen. Paul says in Galatians 4:19, you foolish Galatians, with whom I groan in labor until Christ is formed in you. If you are raising a child and you're seeing sometimes stuff that looks kind of grim and kind of ugly, and like this is not what you thought it was going to look like, or if you're looking at your own life and go, wait a minute, this is not very good. It doesn't really fit too many of the songs. We don't sing this kind of stuff very much at church, and it's just not what I thought it was going to be. I get it. But despite everything you see and everything you hear, new life is stirring. Spiritual formation happens in the labor suite. And that means there's groans, and that means occasionally there's some screams, and there's a lot of hard pushing. And it may not look like it. And maybe this morning, everything you see in your life just looks contrary to this, but do not be fooled. God is at work even in the midst of our thorns and irritations, but the process doesn't always look like progress. And you see that played out vividly in verses 8 and 9 of 2 Corinthians chapter 12. God is at work in Paul's life, but it sure as heck doesn't look like it. So what does Paul do? Well, right off the bat, let's notice Paul prayed about it. Paul prayed about it. He didn't complain about it. He didn't pout. He didn't whine. He prayed. That suggests a posture of faith and trust. He is taking heart in his faith in God, a willingness to give to this thing into the Lord's hands. And that's always where the healing process begins, whether it looks like it or not. Not Lord, if you heal me, I know you'll love me. But Lord, because I know you love me, I'm pleading with you earnestly to heal me. In fact, one of the hardest parts, I think, about the thorn experience for most of us is the why question. the why question. Lord, why is this happening? Like, I really don't need this right now. Like, why don't you make it better? Why don't you make it go away? And it's really important that you know this morning, if you're feeling the pain of a thorn, God is not offended by your struggle. He's not offended by your questions, your pleas. James writes in chapter 1, verses 2 to 8, he says, "Count it all a joy, my brothers, when you meet trials of various kinds, for you know that the testing of your faith produces steadfastness. And let steadfastness have its full effect, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing." And listen to this, verse 5. "If any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask God, who gives generously to all without reproach, and it will be given him. But, this is very important, but let him ask in faith, with no doubting. For one who doubts is like a wave of the sea that is driven and tossed by the wind. For that person must not suppose that he'll receive anything from the Lord. He's a double-minded man, unstable in all his ways." The scripture tells us that Paul, three times, he pleaded with the Lord about this thorn. Which is more likely Paul actually saying, I prayed again and again about this torment. It's not just literally 3 times. And Paul tells us that he did not get the healing he prayed for. He did not get the healing he prayed for. And let me just add a quick parenthesis here, because if you're someone who doubts the validity of the New Testament or the historicity of the New Testament, that you're really not sure about the integrity of scriptures, isn't it interesting here that if Paul had actually really wanted to pad his resume, if Paul was really trying to make Jesus look good, he would have said, "And son of a gun, I got healed." Paul's not trying to pad anything. He's not trying to puff this up. He's speaking truth, and he did not get healed. Now, it's interesting, if you go back in the New Testament, apart from the Gospels, and you just read through Paul's epistles, you will see that Paul cites 4 different cases of sickness. 5 if you count the guy in Acts chapter 14 who was born, he was lame from birth. The first is Philippians chapter 2, 25 to 20, Philemon 2, Philippians 2, 25, 27, Epaphroditus, who Paul describes as a brother and a fellow worker, and we know that he was sick and he was healed. And then 2 Timothy 4:20, Trophimus, apparently one of Paul's many traveling companions, he was sick, but he did not get healed. And then, of course, there was Timothy in 1 Timothy 5:23, where Paul allows us to know that, Timothy is a very, very close ministry partner with Paul. Paul says he's sick frequently. But in that case, rather than some sort of divine healing, Paul encourages him to use means. Like, remember, he said, drink a little wine. It's good for your stomach. And then finally, 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 9, where Paul is sick, but he is not healed. He is given grace. We don't know why. In some of these cases, people are healed, and in some of these cases, they appear not to be healed. God works in different ways, in different situations, and we simply cannot nail it down to a snappy little answer that will fit on a Christian greeting card. It doesn't work like that. The process doesn't always look like progress, but what we can know is that God is at the heart of the process. God's at the heart of the process. Paul prayed again and again and again about this matter, and he did not get healed. What he got instead was the assurance that although it didn't look like it, and it definitely didn't feel like it, God was doing a profound work in his life. Verse 9, because my power is made perfect in weakness. God was saying to Paul, in essence, look, it might feel like you're being broken, but in fact, you're being made strong. You're being weaned away from a dependence on your own pseudo-strength so that you can know the spiritual maturity that comes only from my power in you. So trust me, even though the process doesn't look like progress. In the New Testament, this process is known as crucifying the self. Crucifying the self. It's slowly but surely killing off the parasites and the viruses of pride and self-sufficiency, sin that poison our soul. And it almost always comes through suffering. That's what Jesus is talking about in Luke 9:23. In Luke 9:23, he says, look, if anyone would come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross daily and follow me. And Jesus goes on to say that it's a death that leads to life. In the very next verse comes the promise, verse 24 and 25 of Luke 9, for whoever would save his life will lose it. Whoever loses his life for my sake, you'll save it. For what does it profit a man if he gains the whole world and loses or forfeits himself? It's significant that the very word Paul uses in verse 7 for thorn is really a word more accurately translated stake or nail or spike. The Greek word refers to something sharp, like a stake you would use to impale something, like a nail that might be driven into the hand during crucifixion. Because you see, Paul seemed to understand that part of the reason he was given this thorn was for his own spiritual well-being. That's why he writes in verse 9, look at the text, therefore, I will boast all the more gladly of my weaknesses so that the power of Christ may rest upon me. Paul understood you cannot experience resurrection until you experience death. And that death sometimes is quite painful. I suspect there's some of us here this morning who have been smothered and sort of hurt by this glorious gash of God. And most of us, frankly, we'd be okay if it was just the removal of a little tiny thorn. But really, crucifixion? I mean, does it have to really be? Why can't it be like a plan for your cable company, where you don't have to go with the full extreme package, 5,000 channels and a live video feed, from Kim Kardashian's bedroom, that in fact you can actually just get a smaller, less costly package. Like most of us, I signed up for the self-improvement plan, not the self-impalement plan. Can I just pick the channels I want? Honestly, I'm not interested in that crucifixion plan. Or maybe you're thinking, I'll take care of this myself. I'll just pray a little harder. I'll just read my Bible a little longer. I'll fast between meals. I'll listen to a Christian radio station. I'll even work with teenagers. But brothers and sisters, listen, Paul discovered it takes a deeper cut for Christ to do the kind of surgery that turns weakness to strength. It takes a thorn. It takes a stake. And it's a process that usually doesn't feel much like progress. That's why it's so important for us to understand that this process comes with an amazing promise. Look back at verse 9. He said to me, my grace is sufficient for you. My grace is sufficient for you. My power is made perfect in weakness. After Paul had prayed again and again and again about this matter, he became convinced that God's answer was essentially, no, I'm not going to subtract. I'm not going to subtract your thorn. I'm not going to do that. But in the shadow of that no, Paul was still able to see the blazing light of God's yes. No, I will not subtract your thorn, but here's a clear and certain promise. I will add my grace. Because you see, and this is so important, men and women, for us to understand, God's no always has at its heart a yes. The Lord said, my grace is sufficient for you. My power is made perfect in weakness. And the word sufficient here is from the same Greek verb that is elsewhere translated as satisfy. It can also be translated as to ward off, to defend. In a sense, the Lord is saying, look, my grace will defend you. My grace will satisfy you. My grace is sufficient. This is an amazing promise. And I just want us to know, before we move to finish this morning, is that this promise is in an actual tense of the Greek that is quite unusual. That Jesus didn't say, the text doesn't say, he said, my grace is sufficient. The actual Greek is, he has said, my grace is sufficient. In other words, literally in the Greek, that means this is an action that began but continues into the present. It's an ongoing action. In other words, Paul prayed over and over and over for Jesus to remove his thorn, and over and over and over, Jesus says to him, and will continue to say to him, my grace is sufficient. My grace is sufficient. What an amazing promise this morning. Barbara Brown Taylor, in her book, Learning to Walk in the Dark, talks about an incident that happened in her life when she and her husband were actually exploring the dunes on Cumberland Island off the coast of southern Georgia. And I'm going to read her words because they're much better than would be mine. She says, as we were walking down the beach, we were surprised to come upon a huge loggerhead turtle. And this isn't altogether unusual on the southern coastal shorelines because these turtles come ashore at night to lay their eggs. When they finish the job, they instinctively look around for the brightest horizon to lead them back to the sea. But quite often, the lights on the mainland confuse them. And so rather than crawl for the ocean, they crawl the wrong direction, away from the water and up higher into the sand. Then when the tide goes out, their flippers get buried in the sand and they get stuck, marooned by mid-morning in the hot sand of a morning sun. This turtle was alive, but only barely. Her shell was almost too hot to touch, and they knew that she would be slowly cooked in the hot sand unless she could get back into the water. Barbara Brown Taylor writes that they tried to help the turtle by burying her in cool sand while her husband ran to the nearest ranger station to get help. And she writes, an hour later, the turtle was on her back with tire chains around her front legs. Visualize that. She's being dragged behind a Park Service Jeep back toward the ocean. The poor turtle's mouth was filled with sand and her head was so bent. Taylor said, I feared her neck would break, but it didn't. When they got to the edge of the water, the three rangers undid the chains, gently flipped the turtle right side up, and watched as she lay motionless in the surf. After a few minutes, the cool ocean water began to revive her, and within a few more minutes, the waves lifted her up. She pushed off with her back legs and swam back into the water that was her home. And that's when Taylor observes, watching her swim slowly away after her nightmare ride through the dunes, I noted that it is sometimes hard to tell whether you're being killed or saved by the hands that turn your life upside down. If that's your story this morning, I want to encourage you to take heart. Have faith in God. These thorns are painful, but the great news is that God has already been impaled on our behalf, and he promises us grace that is sufficient. And if maybe this morning you're not feeling the thorns, it's great, you're feeling good, trust that they will come. They will come. And through them, God will work. It may not look like it, may be kind of ugly, it'll be painful, there'll be some pushing, maybe even some screaming, because the process doesn't always look like progress. But take heart. Have faith in God. Let's pray. Lord, thank you again for these amazing people, for the chance to share your word with them this week, for our meals together, for the music we worship to together and enjoy together, for the laughter of our children, for the study of the word. Lord, we are a grateful people. Thank you so much for Mount Hermon, for their staff and all they've done to show us hospitality. And now, Lord, would you help us, give us grace to open up our hearts, every corner, every room of it, so that we might make space for you to do your rebirth, your recreation, your renovation work in our lives. And we do this, Lord, because we have heart, we have faith that you are a good and gracious God. And all God's people said, amen. Thanks again, everybody.